Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for making this event on climate change in the context of armed conflict, specifically the situation in Yemen. My name is Gauthier. I'm a human rights officer at the Geneva International Center for Justice, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before I get into introducing our excellent speakers and discussing the topic of the subject of today, just a couple little housekeeping items for how we're going to run this. So first of all, per UN regulations, no photos are allowed at this event, but we do have people circulating throughout who will be taking pictures, and if you'd like pictures, you could just come at the end and ask us and we'll share them with you. Second is interpretation in English is available as well as in Arabic. Channel 2 for English, Channel 3 for Arabic. And lastly, we have some time for questions at the end, so please keep your comments and questions until then. We'll take a few and then have the speakers respond. Okay, so I think we're good to get started. I'm just going to introduce the topic here. So climate change poses a significant threat to human rights globally. Rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and sea level rise already endanger millions of people around the world, including through their access to fundamental resources such as food, water, and shelter. And as environmental degradation worsens, climate-related displacement will only increase, forcing people from their homes and undermining their rights to security and cultural identity. Vulnerable communities and developing nations bear the brunt of these impacts despite contributing the least to global emissions. According to the World Bank, without immediate drastic action from the international community, more than 130 million people worldwide, especially in the most vulnerable countries, will be pushed to extreme poverty by 2030. Women and children will disproportionately suffer from these effects. And Yemen is among the countries that are going to be most affected by this trend, especially in regards to environmental effects such as drought, extreme flooding, sudden disease outbreaks, pests, changes in rainfall patterns, increased storm frequency and severity, and sea level rise, all of which have devastating consequences that threaten the country's already fragile state. According to the Informed Climate Change Index, which was developed in partnership with the United Nations and the European Commission, among other international organizations, Yemen ranks third among the countries most vulnerable to climate change and least prepared for climate shocks, only after Somalia and South Sudan. This dire situation has only been worsened by the violent activities of the Houthi militia. The Houthis, who now control large portions of northern and western Yemen, have for years committed grave human rights abuses and acts of terror, many of which have direct consequences on the local environment. Their attacks on ships and naval vessels, for example, have caused massive oil spills and leakages of hazardous chemicals near Yemeni communities, while their use of heavy weaponry and missile attacks have destroyed key infrastructure such as fuel storage facilities, water treatment plants, and power plants. And just as these conditions have worsened, Houthi forces have imposed severe restrictions on humanitarian aid, blocking access to critical supplies and exacerbating famine. Joining us to shed light on the situation are three excellent speakers, Walid Al-Qadimi, Abdullah Al-Habaishi, and Mohammed Al-Mahdi. Mr. Walid Al-Qadimi is the first deputy governor of the Hudaydah Governorate, located in western Yemen, and representative of the local authority at the symposium. He is widely known for his development effort in relief and reconstruction work in the Governorate, which has been severely impacted by recent climate change-related events. Next, we're going to have a video statement from Abdullah Al-Habaishi, who unfortunately could not make it today. Mr. Al-Habaishi is the executive director of the Humanitarian Work Cell organization in Yemen, which is the largest humanitarian relief organization in western Yemen. He is also a human rights activist, an active participant in numerous international, regional, and local conferences focused on defending human rights and promoting sustainable development goals. And finally, we have Mr. Mohammed Al-Mahdi, who is a well-known Yemeni journalist and media professional with numerous contributions with international and Arabic satellite TV channels and newspapers. He has participated in a number of conferences on the situation in Yemen, and he also works as a volunteer in several Yemeni human rights organizations. So with that, I now give the floor to Mr. Walid Al-Qadimi.
Greetings and may God's blessings be upon you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, and through you all the participants in the 57th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council. At the outset, I'd like to express my gratitude and thanks to the Association Mauna for Human Rights and Immigration and the Geneva International Center for Justice for their coordination, which led to my presence here today in this international symposium, and on which many people depend, especially those who seek rights and freedoms around the world, and the innocent people. I stand before you today not as a representative of the local authorities in the Governorate of Al-Hudaydah, but I'm a voice for millions of Yemenis who are crushed under catastrophic humanitarian conditions that have aggravated because of the armed conflict and climate change that are accelerating. And reports show that the upcoming climate change will lead to heavy rains and storms that might lead to new floods and new suffering for the citizens more than before. The updated reports show that the United Nations Rapid Response Mechanism that Yemen has witnessed a noticeable increase in the number of displacement and floods since January 2024. About 489,545 people have been displaced because of the armed conflict and the climate change-related crises. These climate impacts intertwine greatly with the continuous struggle in Yemen. The conflicts have led to more climate change crises because the infrastructure for water and agriculture has been greatly destroyed, which has led the populations more subject to climate change impact. And with floods and drought, many Yemenis are forced to be displaced, which creates new humanitarian crises. In addition to that, the bad climate circumstances lead to the spread of diseases and leads to an increased health burden in a health system that is in collapse. The rapid response mechanism provided quick and important life-saving assistance to 423,451 persons in 20 Yemeni governorates. Despite that, the challenges remain big, especially since 22% of these families are dependent on women for bread-earning activities, and 21% depend on the elderly, and 10% of families include disabled people with disabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, the mines that have been planted by the Houthi terrorist militia is one of the greatest threats that Yemen is facing, not just at the humanitarian level, but also at the level of the environment and agriculture and economy. Since the beginning of Massam project to remove mines, 463,673 mines have been removed, in addition to munitions and explosive devices, which helped in recovering 60,266,351 square meters of Yemeni land that were gorged with the mines. And had they been left without removal, they would have continued to kill innocent people and maiming them for decades to come. And it could lead to the destruction of agricultural land and habitation and subjecting local societies to permanent danger. And this is an unprecedented mockery of the lives of civilians, because the Houthi militias do not distinguish between a child, a woman, and an elderly, and does not give value to life or to the safety of nature. As for the other crimes perpetrated by the Houthi militia, legal organizations have documented crimes of exploding homes since March 2014. More than 900 cases of home explosions have been documented in 15 governorates in Yemen. These explosions did not only target the homes of civilians, but also included mosques and worship institutions. And these crimes are another proof of this mockery with regards to the lives of people and their properties. And there's a clear mockery of the religious and humanitarian values. And these acts, which are barbaric, aim at disseminating fear amongst the Yemenis and destroying the societal infrastructure, which will increase the humanitarian wounds and increase internal dispute. And in addition to this suffering, the Houthi militias prevent on purpose the arrival of humanitarian organization in those areas under their control, and they have even arrested some personnel of those organizations abusively. And this increases the suffering of the people who find themselves hanging between war and natural disasters. And it is clear how human suffering is used to obtain political gains. The Governorate of Al-Hudaydah in particular has become a symbol for this suffering, because what was in the past a fertile agricultural region and a vital port for the tradesmen and fishermen has become a place for continued floods and conflicts. And the grave violations perpetrated by the terrorist Houthi militias to implement their military and political agendas. The Hudaydah parts, which were the lifeblood of Madanians and the world as a whole, one day has become today military bases for terrorist Houthi militias. These ports that were an entry point for the influx of humanitarian assistance and food to Yemen have become tools of war, and the militias did not suffice to deprive millions of Yemenis from basic material, but used these ports to threaten the waterways, the international waterways in the Red Sea. And therefore, the global economy is threatened. And the Red Sea has become an international epicenter of concern, not just because of the continuous threats to the commercial ships, but because these waterways are used for illegal purposes that had threatened the region and the world as a whole. More surprising is that the militia Houthi continuously refuses to open the humanitarian corridors between the regions they control and the regions that are controlled by the legitimate government. And this hinders the arrival of humanitarian assistance and increases the suffering of the Yemeni people, especially in view of the increased climate crises like the latest floods that hit Al-Hudaydah Governorate and the other Yemeni governorates. Millions of people in the region that are under the control of the Houthi militias in Al-Hudaydah are suffering because of the isolation imposed upon them, where their suffering is used as a political weapon. And what increases the suffering is that the abuse by the Houthi militias has forced more than 21,000 families to be displaced from the region they controlled to the region that were liberated in the province of Hudaydah. And this led to more pressure on the limited resources in those regions. Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing today an environmental and humanitarian catastrophe that requires an immediate international intervention. Al-Hudaydah is not just a local problem, but it represents the global crises, where the humanitarian crises intertwine with the climate changes and the armed conflicts. And had it not been for the Stockholm Convention that prevented the liberation of the Hudaydah Governorate, the Houthi terrorist militias would not have been able to use the coastlines and the ports and to use them for military purposes that threaten peace and security both locally and internationally. And it is up to the international community to bear its responsibility to provide the necessary support for the Governorate of Al-Hudaydah, and we call upon opening the humanitarian corridors and the arrival of assistance, and to remove the mines that represent a threat to the lives of the civilians. We in the local authorities and under the guidance of the Presidential Leadership Council and in coordination with the Humanitarian Action Cell in the Western Atihami Coast, we would like to alleviate the suffering of the people according to the resources available. And we are cooperating with the humanitarian legal organization implementing the humanitarian projects on the ground whether at the level of the international or local organization, to help all those who have been harmed, whether in our regions or in the regions under control of the terrorist Houthi militias that have refused the arrival of humanitarian assistance from the liberated regions to save those who have been harmed by the climate change. Finally, I'd like to talk about something important in addition to the negative impact of the climate change, which is the arrest of women and the elderly and the children and men. And they are being hidden by force. And here we call upon their release without exception. Also recruiting children in the army and stealing agricultural land and confiscating them. And this is what the Irani militias perpetrate in Iraq and in other countries that are under the control of their militias. It is important to strengthen the international cooperation and to unify efforts in order to deal with these humanitarian violations perpetrated in view of the continuous crises. We hope that our participation here will contribute to push the international community to take active steps to help the Yemeni people and to improve their living conditions. Finally, I can only thank the brotherly nations that have stood by Yemen in these difficult circumstances, especially the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia through the King Salman Center for Humanitarian Assistance, and the state of the UAE through its humanitarian, the Emirati Red Crescent, and the brotherly state of Kuwait through the Kuwait Project, and other countries and donor funds that have responded to the call for relief launched by the Yemeni government and after or following the floods and torrents, and for their continuous support in providing relief and humanitarian assistance. This support that includes great efforts that contribute in saving lives of the civilians and restoring hope and stability for Yemen and its people. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to provide you with a video that sheds light on the magnitude of this catastrophe and the violations perpetrated by the Houthi militias against the Yemeni people and environment. I hope that this video will push us all to save Yemen and in general, and Al-Hudaydah Governorate in particular. I thank you all for your kind assistance, and I hope that my words today will be the beginning of an international movement that is genuine to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people and to pave the way towards a future that is more stable and safe and humane. And may God's blessings be upon you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Qadimi, for sharing this perspective. I think the scale of the violence of the Houthi militia, both on individual persons and their freedoms and also on the local environment, is difficult to quantify, but this gives us that perspective that we need, that local perspective, so thank you. Next, we have a video intervention by Mr. Al-Habayshi, who unfortunately couldn't make it today.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. التغيرات المناخية في اليمن. تلقي التغيرات المناخية بتداعياتها في مختلف نواحي الحياة كافة وتؤثر سلبا
and have a negative impact on land and man and plays a major role in the life of communities and peoples, and climate change has a consequence. Therefore, it could be a threat and everybody has to face it through cooperation and solidarity and benefiting from international experiences and expertise which are successful. These climate change consequences have had an impact on Yemen greatly, which has led to dangerous challenges in the various sectors, and these are as follows: the water challenges and the scarcity of water. Secondly, the environmental safety and health impact. Thirdly, malnutrition and the absence of food security. Fourth, the impact of climate change on earning wages, and then the shelters and the camps camps of the displaced, and then desertification and the deterioration of agricultural. And in the middle of this year, Yemen has been subject to floods and grave climate changes, and these heavy rains and the torrents led to the destruction of many homes of the civilians in various governorates, whether in Hadramaut Governorate or Ma'rab or Hajjah or Ta'az or Al-Hudaydah Governorate. We, in the western coast of both Ta'az and Hudaydah governorates, we received calls of relief from the concerned and local authorities, and from the very beginning, the Humanitarian Action Cell, under the instructions of the Presidential Leadership Cell, provided all the mechanisms and food and distributed food and shelter material to all those harmed by this catastrophe. Since the very beginning, we worked with all the rescue teams and we built shelters so that we could protect the populations and villages and cities that had been harmed. Also, the relief teams provided thousands of food baskets and also food material and shelter material and also financial assistance so that they could, for those harmed and impacted, to recover. The Humanitarian Action Cell has already worked in the environment and implemented tens of projects to support the environment, and also worked with renewed and clean energy, and implemented solar energy stations that provides 20 megawatt of energy, and implemented 10 stations to desalinate water from the Red Sea in the western coast of Yemen, and also implemented tens of campaigns to plant trees as part of the activities to combat desertification. And the Humanitarian Action Cell also carried out work to get rid of waste in most of the cities and villages that are within the geographical region where we have access. Finally, we would like to thank the UAE and the Emirati Red Crescent that has spared no effort. It is always a pioneer in providing assistance, whether relief assistance or urgent or developmental assistance. We do not also forget to thank the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia through the King Salman Center that provided food assistance and shelter assistance to those harmed in the governorates of Hajjah and Ma'rab. We thank the brothers in the Geneva International Center for Justice, as well as the Associated Ma'una for Human Rights and Immigration, for holding this symposium, and through which we were able to provide you with our message to you and to the world. They are our partners in the humanitarian action in the country and outside the country. And we also thank all the international organizations and local organizations that contributed in providing assistance to the affected people within Yemen. And we call upon the donors to increase their support to the Republic of Yemen so that they can come out of this crisis and face these challenges, and also to prepare preventive plans to face climate change challenges in the future. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Al-Habayshi for those remarks, and also for the work that the Humanitarian Work Cell organization is doing in Yemen. And lastly, I'll give the floor to Mr. Al-Mahdi.
Greetings and may God's blessings be upon you at the outset. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you to all those who have come to this important activity, and I'd like to thank the Association Ma'una for Human Rights and the Geneva International Center for Justice, who have organized this important activity that speaks about one of the most important situations in my country, Yemen. And I will try to speak of important points and not repeat what Mr. Walid and Mr. Al-Hubayshi have already mentioned to avoid repetition. I will concentrate at the outset that Yemen suffers from many problems, and recently the question of climate change, and many of the countries around the world suffer from climate change. Yemen also, and for decades, has been suffering from scarcity of potable water for decades, and the continued rise in temperature for 60 years. And it is likely to continue to rise until the year 2060. And this crisis has worsened with the outbreak of the recent conflict and the coup of the Houthi militias against the legitimate state in 2014. And until today, this has led to displacement, migration, planting of mines and camouflage mines, the collapse of the infrastructure, and more recently, the pollution of the Red Sea due to the Houthi militia attacks on tankers without considering the consequences, which have put us today on the verge of an environmental disaster. Climate change and has its effects, and with the continued rise in temperature and the instability of rainfall levels, Yemen has become more vulnerable to catastrophic climate phenomena, including hurricanes, floods, and destructive torrents. For example, one, Cyclone Chapala in 2015. The cyclone unleashed an unprecedented torrent of rainfall, and it was estimated that it led to displacement of more than 1 million people. Secondly, Cyclone Makono in 2018. And although the cyclone had the strongest impact on the Sultanate of Oman, it swept over parts of Yemen, in particular the island of Socotra, and forcing 500 families to flee their homes. Thirdly, Cyclone Teague in 2023, which brought dire consequences to the governorates of Socotra, Hadramaut, and Al-Mahra. And the impact of the cyclone was devastating, in addition to its effects on the infrastructure and the buildings. However, it also disrupted agriculture and fisheries, which are vital to the economy, and which increased the stress on fragile resources and magnified the challenges facing the local population. In addition to the floods that took place in the Ma'rib Dam in 2020, and also the governorates that were harmed and that are neighboring Al-Hudaydah, like Wajah and Mahwiya. And this brings me to concentrate on important topics that we have to refer to with regards to the way the armed militias and gangs deal with these changes. At the outset, please allow me to speak about the ideological dimension of these armed gangs, and especially the Houthi groups that control most of the harmed areas. And this dimension is unfortunately based on a different understanding of these changes, different to the way that the rest of the world that suffer from such climate changes and such catastrophes and how they deal with them. These militias understand, or they have a catastrophic vision of these changes according to very superficial understandings, based on the understandings of these groups who see that speaking about these changes is within an international conspiracy against them and against Yemen. And therefore they refuse to deal with any measures as those that are exercised by all countries of the world in order to limit the risks that these changes could lead to. And this is what happened in Yemen in particular with regards to vaccines. And the Houthis refused many times to deal with vaccines, especially the children's polio vaccine. And this ideology becomes more dangerous because the militias are trying to change this ideological dimension into a societal culture through their numerous campaigns and through their the trainings they impose on their personnel and in schools. And they use false information, misleading information to convince people not to be vaccinated, and as an example with regards to their dealings with the problem of climate. Symposia and conferences were held in Sana'a in the region that are controlled by the Houthi groups. The aim of these conferences is to warn about the danger of vaccines. Even one of them spoke and apologized to the Yemeni people, and he said one of the days he was a supporter of vaccines, and he considered that part of a crime perpetrated by the world against Yemeni people. That is the way by which the armed groups and the Yemen and the Houthi groups who have certain ideologies would like to deal with these important measures, and this is reflected primarily in their dealing with this understanding with regards to the climate change. In this context, the Houthi militias have dealt with the legal and humanitarian organizations and criminalized them, and that was also part of a great problem with regards to the relief campaigns. And I think that Mr. Hubayshi talked about that in his intervention, and by their non-dealing with a non-acceptance of dealing with the organizations. And this is a problem because these organizations were carrying out an important role to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people, and were carrying out an important role in raising awareness and in providing relief. And the Houthi militias, for example, with regards to their dealings with these organizations on the 10th of July of 2024, by arresting a group, and they said that they were part of spies who were working for the Americans, and also they arrested personnel working in the organization, and they justified that, the Houthi justified that by putting pressure on the arrested people so that they come up with testimonies, which was the source of mockery for all those who heard these testimonies. A lot of mockery was seen at the level of the Houthis, but the threat is that they criminalize any civilian action, and they consider civilian action as a crime, and they present this to people as a recognition. For example, amongst these recognitions or on YouTube, and you can see them, some of the people said that they were carrying out English speaking training courses, and many of international statements and organization statements that dealt with this file and these arrests. And also some of people were arrested because they were working in the field of climate change. I'd like to add to what was mentioned by Mr. Walid with regards to the conflict in the Red Sea, is that amongst the catastrophic results in the militia dealings is that they are showing lots of mockery with regards to what took place in the Red Sea, and the world had been witness to the catastrophic outcomes because of the terrorist actions undertaken by the Houthis in the Red Sea, and which will have an impact in the future. And I bring you back to the past to remind you about how the militia Houthis deal with the Safar Stockware, and which could have led to a huge environmental catastrophe in the region, and if there wasn't a lot of pressure by the international community, that led to positive outcome. And this renders us call upon more pressure on these gangs that are having a great impact on any measure that could alleviate these sufferings. Please allow me to refer to an important topic that has to do with the planting of mines, which Mr. Walid has mentioned. However, I'd like to say that planting mines is a problem that would remain for many years to come. I'd like to remind you that Yemen was suffering from the problem of mines, and Many people are still falling victim to these mines of the past and until very recently. And therefore, the problem of mines is a catastrophic and huge problem that will still remain in the future. What we call upon, and through this symposium or through this space that was given to us, is to put more pressure on these gangs, and more efforts and have to be undertaken internationally to alleviate the suffering of people in Yemen and in all the countries of the world. I thank you profusely for providing me with this opportunity to speak. Thank you for your kind assistance.
Thank you, Mr. Mahdi, for sharing your remarks, and to all three speakers for describing the situation and speaking out for the Yemeni people while denouncing the crimes of the Houthi militia. We do have some time for questions, and please feel free to drop some comments as well, and then we'll give an opportunity for the speakers to respond. So are there any questions from the audience?
Thank you. Thank you for all the speakers, Al-Mahdi and Mr. Al-Qadimi. Thank you for mediator also. Thank you. I prefer speaking in Arabic. Yes.
Thank you to you all. Mr. Al-Qadimi mentioned many of the violations that have to do with the environment in the Red Sea. These pollutions and the latest attacks, also mentioned by Mr. Al-Mahdi, perpetrated by the militias in the Red Sea, had led to the pollution of the environment. But these attacks against the militias by Israel, which responded in the Al-Hudaydah region, did they also participate in polluting the environment? Especially since these attacks targeted fuel tanks and fuel reservoirs. In addition to a question that has to do with mines, does the local authority have any idea of the number of those mines? I know it is difficult to come up with figures and statistics, and there are no maps of those mines. Even the militias themselves don't have, that planted those mines might not have any maps about concerning these maps. They planted the mines maybe chaotically and haphazardly, and they do not have maybe any maps regarding these mines. But can you maybe identify the regions in which these mines exist to ensure that these mines do not cause casualties to civilians? In addition to what was said by Mr. Al-Mahdi, and I have a question for him, these recent arrests that took place by the Houthi militias and the confessions that were forced to be made on TV by the Houthis, that became a mockery, because organizing English training courses has become a crime in the eyes of the Houthis. The Houthi militias are as other militias, they are irregular groups, but they are active in the violation of human rights. And therefore, do you believe that the Houthis will continue to carry out such violations? And what are the international pressures that you are asking for? You said the international community has to put pressure on the Houthi militias. I believe that putting pressure on them is not enough. You have to put pressure on those who support them, like the Iranian government, because the militias themselves, or putting pressure on the militias themselves, will be weak. You have to create more pressure on those who support them. But putting pressure on the militias themselves will be weak and might not be useful. That is my opinion. I'd like to know the opinion of the speakers. Thank you very much, and I do not want to be too lengthy. with regards to the mines that have been planted by the terrorist Houthi militias. We estimate that the number of mines that have been planted is about 1 million mines. Those that have been planted in Al-Hudaydah in general. Today we have full teams in all the forces on the coastline that are removing the mines directly. Once a mine has exploded in a region or notification has been made about the presence of those mines, they have planted these mines, the Houthis, without preparing any maps. We are facing a huge environmental catastrophe which will continue for years to come. We will suffer from them, and the people of Yemen will suffer from them in general. These mines were planted not just as individual mines or anti-personal mines, but they were planted as camouflaged mines amongst trees and rocks and stones, and between the homes of the civilians who were forced to be displaced and who had to leave and flee their homes. When they these civilians returned to some villages or to their homes, we were surprised to many mines that killed and maimed children who lost their limbs, their hands, their legs because of these mines. So our anti-mine teams are working. I'd like to add to this the continuous cooperation with the Massam project to bring back life to the liberated regions of the Governorate. God willing, we will find the necessary support from the supporting partners in the United Nations and international organizations and in the alliance in order to increase support through raise awareness campaigns and campaigns to remove these mines. And this is a process that will last for some years to come. We can only remove these mines by liberating every inch of our land from these militias. These militias do not respect any law. They do not accept to respect international law. They are militias who only work for their own interests and to achieve political objectives for Iran. The pressures required to be put on the Houthis, and which we are calling for, not just to put pressure on the Houthi militias, but on those who support them, the major supporter, which is Iran. Iran today is disrespectful with 4 Arab countries, and we hope that Yemen and the other countries will not fall to the corruption of Iran. The legitimate government tried through the Presidential Leadership Council to work in the regions that are under control of the militia groups, but a lot of pressure has been put on the Yemeni military government. Today we are calling upon the international community that see these Houthi crimes in the sea and on the ground to stand by the legitimate government in order to put an end and to get rid of these militias, so that all the Yemeni people can come back from abroad to live in our country for us and for our children and the next generation. We do not want anybody to hamper and destroy the infrastructure of Yemen. The Houthi terrorist militia is not actually retaliating against Israel, but is calling upon Israel to target the infrastructure in Yemen, which is the property of the Yemeni people. It has allowed other countries to interfere in the Yemeni sovereignty, and therefore we call upon the international community to stand by the legitimate government of Yemen and to liberate Yemen from these militias, and so that Yemen can come back to what it was, the happy Yemen of the past. Thank you. The dear speaker had asked two other questions. Mr. Walid answered the question of the pressure to be put on the militias, and no doubt when we say putting pressure on the militia Houthi, we talk about putting pressure on those who support the militias, because they disrespect all the international rules and the decisions, and they are fighting international rule, and the results were catastrophic in this context. Therefore, we have to put pressure on Iran, since Iran is the major supporter and the major party that plans for these militias. As with regards to the continuous violations, you said, could these continue? Yes, with certainty. These violations will continue as long as the militias exist. And I will give you an example of the file of the arrested people. At a time when there is an exchange of prisoners, and at the same time where you have an exchange of prisoners, the Houthis replace those whom they have liberated through the efforts of the Red Cross and others by other detainees, and they arrest people from their homes. And this is what is happening now. Those who declared that they will celebrate the national day on a number of them were arrested, and campaigns are being carried out to liberate them. And the news are saying that one of those arrested people, we do not know how precise this information is. This information is, as they said, one of the arrested people and one of the journalists died because of torture inside prison. And I think that you are all aware about this. And therefore, the question of violation can continue. They are permanent. So with regards to organizations or with regard to those who oppose them politically, the catastrophe of this topic, which I'm trying to concentrate on, as I said, and as you said, the Houthis provide justifications which are a source of mockery. Somebody who provides English training courses becomes a criminal, and his activity becomes criminalized. And they're trying to establish a society that does not accept such training courses, and that's part of their strategy in combating education. And this goes back to the strategy and the history of this group, the militia groups, which want to render people ignorant. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Are there any other questions from the audience? Well, in that case, we can draw this side event to a close. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to our 3 speakers today. And I hope you carry with you the lessons learned from this and put pressure where needed to improve the situation in Yemen. Thank you.